This is Natasha Helfer, and I wanted to just give you a few updates that are happening at Symmetry Counseling and in my practice in the coming months. I will be holding my first ketamine group session on January 25th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in our Holiday, Utah office, with the theme being Reclaiming Female Sexuality. There's 15 spots available, so I know that they'll go quickly, so make sure you call to register. We are super excited to be using ketamine at Symmetry. It's an extremely helpful medicine in helping people with stuck thinking patterns. So this is where so many people benefit from, either past trauma or past education, past sex negative messaging, lots of things that you can feel stuck on and you want to kind of redirect and re-explore your body, your preferences, your identity, your joy, your pleasure, right? And we want to get old thinking unstuck. So super excited to be offering this. It will be kind of a uniquely guided experience. I'm going to curate for you to feel safe and to be able to explore a lot of these themes that we're going to be talking about. If you are a current client of mine or past client of mine, I'm offering an additional 10% off the early bird or regular price, depending on when you sign up. You have until December 15th to still benefit from the early bird rate. Yeah, just call the office for information and you will be able to get registered for that. Other groups, I'm starting in January. So my pretty popular Navigating Ethical Non-Monogamy group is going to be starting on January 17th on Fridays from noon to 1:30 Mountain Time. You can join these anywhere in the world as long as it works with your time difference changes. And it will be 7 weeks long, and it is for either couples or individuals who are interested in potentially starting non-monogamy in their lives, or maybe have already been in the lifestyle but are wanting to either get better at certain aspects of it, learn how to deal with challenges in more effective ways. I will also be doing a Healing from Male Sexual Shame group starting on January 30th. This will be on Thursdays from noon to 1:30, again, Mountain Time, again, online, so you can join me from anywhere. And this group is kind of for people who identify as male and either come from purity culture, sex negative thinking, and potentially also were treated under the sex addiction narrative and ways that has hurt them from considering themselves just on the spectrum of human diversity versus diseased or sick or something along those lines. So that's also a very popular group, and I encourage you to sign up for that if you haven't. I also have one of my providers, Sarah Rands. She's going to be offering a group on dating and kind of the typical challenges of dating as an adult. It's meant for any gender, any sexual orientation, and that will be a 6-week also online group. So if you're interested in that as well, call the office at Symmetry Counseling. And I also want to let people know that we have 2 current interns at our practice who are taking on new clients, as well as some of our more established providers. So we do have openings at Symmetry Counseling. I know sometimes people have a hard time finding a therapist with openings. And we work with all the general things as well, of course, the specific intersection and expertise on religion, mental health, and sexuality. So that's a little bit about us, and hope you're having a great day. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel or also offering a donation to keep this podcast alive. And thank you so much for listening.
Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame anywhere we can get it, where we try to bring light to discussions and things that are happening, especially in the intersection of like mental health, religion, and sexuality. Those are kind of like the things that we primarily focus as a practice, my practice at Symmetry Counseling, which today I only have one of my providers here. We're going to have a discussion about the recent article that came out written by Peggy Fletcher Stack in the Salt Lake Tribune about the changes that Brigham Young University has been definitely going forward with, in the last several years, right? So it's been about 3 or 4 years since we had that talk from Elder Holland about kind of gathering the forces together and making sure that we stand, that the university stands by its kind of religious convictions and prioritizing that really over academic freedom or peer review, evidence-based research, or, things of that nature, that they're really kind of making this push towards sticking to their religious standards, which it's always an interesting intersection, right, is education and religion. There's a long history in the United States of those two things being coinciding. You have a lot of Catholic schools in the nation. You have, of course, other universities like Notre Dame and lots of different Christian universities and Christian programs throughout the country. And wherein lies some of either the benefits and also the risks of having that intersection between those two things, especially for emerging adult students who, although they are adult, when we're thinking about 18, 19, 20-year-old folks, these are still highly vulnerable, folks who are usually still dependent on family and parents financially. And if not, if they can't get help from their parents to go to school, then they're definitely dependent on government help and federal funding to try to get their education. What are our standards for education, right? So this is what we're here to talk about. And Angie Millet, who is one of my providers at Symmetry Counseling, has kind of done a deeper dive, I think, into a lot of these things. And I kind of want to pick your brain about what you're thinking and what you're finding and what are some of the implications that I think are good to be discussing when facing this issue. So I'll be quiet now.
Thanks. That's a perfect intro. So yeah, a couple of weeks ago, Peggy Fletcher Stack released the article that she had been working on for quite a while surrounding the 2021-2022 changes to the honor code that faculty and staff must sign, where there is a sort of loyalty oath wherein they ask you all the normal ecclesiastical endorsement questions that all students and staff have always had to do on an annual basis. But then at the bottom of it, there was an open-ended, section about the church's, do you believe and are you faithful to the church's stance on gender, family, and all of that. And not only did it impact, faculty and staff, but also their spouses, their partners, their families. And it really was, according to her research and the people that she was speaking with, a big deal on campus for the faculty. This is something that is above and beyond what is required for a temple recommend. It's above and beyond what is required of just, normal, regular people who are faithful in their church. She's talked about a little bit about how there's this committee that, does maybe a deeper dive on new faculty hires and current faculty, looking at social media and whatnot. And so faculty who current faculty didn't feel comfortable coming forward, and she said she interviewed dozens, are now, hiding. They don't feel, and I've talked to some people in my own life, they don't feel comfortable, speaking up in church or having a gay pride flag in their yard or a political sign in their yard or anything. Like it seems very, very scary and a very scary, dark time for folks who are, not just for the students who are, LGBTQIA, but also for faculty and staff and their families. So also spouses are having to have these interviews and sign these forms and be participants in holding this loyalty oath. So that's kind of where it started a few weeks ago. And, she talked a lot about, it's starting to feel like, and people have shared with her, it's starting to feel like the 50s with Ernest Wilkinson when he was president, and the McCarthy stuff that was going on in the country, and just feeling very, very scared. People are feeling very scared. And again, nobody's willing to come forward who is a current faculty or staff member because they're afraid for their job, which is totally understandable. My question in all of this is, I hate that for everybody, but two things that really stand out to me, because I work in higher ed at another institution, is what about federal funding? Like, what about the Title IV funding that students are eligible for federal financial aid? What about that? Sure, the school is primarily, self-funded, the church schools, but what about federal funding? Don't they have anti-discrimination policies? Yes, they do. But BYU or schools like it can get religious exemptions. Okay, so that's one thing that I've been really wondering about. And then the other thing is, in the musket fire speech that Holland gave several years ago, or a few years ago, he talked about how he didn't care about accreditation. He doesn't care if the schools, lose their accreditation. But what about the programs? So I'm a social work student, and just like you as a licensed marriage and family therapist have a code of ethics, we have a code of ethics too. And it specifically talks about how we fight for, oppressed and marginalized communities. We are tasked with, it's not just a choice. It's like, it's part of we talk about it all the time. And so how does that fall in for a social work faculty, for teaching about fighting for social justice and fighting for those who are oppressed? So those are just kind of the things that are in my head all the time since I've been reading and talking and looking into this particular issue.
Yes. And from everything you just said, I have 20 different thoughts, right? Of course.
Of course.
Yeah. So I think it would be good if we spent some time talking about kind of the academia part, the professor part, the program part, but then also maybe we can spend some time talking about the student body part, right? And the different implications that we have here. And I guess I just want to start out by just putting on the table that here in the United States of America, where we have these, rules and ideas around academic liberty and accreditation and what that means and what each program has to basically show that they're able to provide in order to meet those accreditation standards. All of that is under the umbrella of a very important value of kind of the American psyche, which is what we call religious freedom, right? Religious freedom. I remember hearing about this, very early on in my education, in elementary school, right? That this is part of why we went to war with Britain, or, all those kinds of things, right? That we wanted religious freedom. And so what's been interesting as I've, become more understanding of what this actually means, what religious freedom means, I was under kind of the naive guise that religious freedom meant, everybody has a right to their ways of thinking and their ways of worship. And I agree with that. I think everybody should have their right to believe what they want to believe and worship as they would like to worship. But when it comes to legal implications and accreditation implications and political implications, what starts happening is that the majority group really imposes their religious beliefs and codifies their religious beliefs into the cultural and political system, so that it really isn't so much about religious freedom for everybody. It's about imposing certain religious beliefs on others, and or creating spaces where religious discrimination is absolutely allowed and even supported under this kind of religious freedom guise, which, again, I can disagree with it all day long. But BYU has a right to exist. BYU has a right to discriminate. BYU has a right to whatever beliefs they want to, to share or to espouse. But I think what you're bringing up is then, do they have the right to have these legal protections? Right. And federal funding protections and accreditation protections? And I think this is where it gets mucky, And I think what you're saying, we have these religious exemptions that allow, for example, churches not to pay taxes, right? Or churches to have things that would go against really all the standards of non-discrimination that are true for most businesses, companies, universities, etc. So they can opt out, and so they have a right to do that. However, I think this is where, as a taxpayer and a citizen of this country, I am not comfortable. I'm like, if you want to discriminate and kind of be unhealthy and live in ignorance, you have every right to do that. I do not want to support that with my taxpayer dollars.
Right.
Nor do I want my children to go to an institution like that, nor do I want those values, kind of forced upon me. And this is where it gets mucky, I think, when we're talking about the university as a whole and then emerging adults, because the regular kind of feedback I get back from people is like, well, but they know what they're getting into, right? They sign the honor code. Even these professors that are like, upset and they don't want to come forward and they're worried for their jobs. The very simple answer is, well, go find another job then. Don't work there, right? Don't go to school there. And that really minimizes and underscores, one, the fact that not all Latter-day Saints, if we're talking about BYU, not all Latter-day Saints, we're not a monolith. We don't all believe the same things.
Right.
Even under the bigger umbrella of kind of the gospel of Jesus Christ, there's lots, the pews show this all the time, that there's lots of LDS folks that are actually very LGBT affirming, that are very educated, that believe in things like evolution, that, and so who are the Mormons, who are the Latter-day Saints who get to decide what Mormons believe or not believe, right? And typically that's run by a more conservative, orthodox aspect of the religious spectrum as a whole. And then that gets imposed. And then it also minimizes the fact that, yes, although at 18 you are an adult, you're not free from the influence and the, in many ways, kind of coercion that happens in these, Mormon families. Like, well, this is the only education parents are willing to pay for example. We will only pay for your education if you go to BYU. Or it also doesn't account for emerging adult developmental tasks. For example, how many people are still figuring out something as complex as sexual orientation or gender identity because they haven't really been allowed to explore that in their earlier teens, when it's more developmentally appropriate to start exploring those things. So many folks are just starting to come into their own ideas about that in their late teens, early 20s. And so, yes, even though they have signed those things, there's implications for them. I myself, I'm a BYU alumni, and I went to Brigham Young University. I was not queer. However, I was sexually active. And at the time, in my mindset back then, that was a sin. And I agreed with that was a sin. And so I went in and I confessed and did all the things that I was supposed to do to, kind of repent and get back into the good graces of, what I believe to be God and all those things. And I was basically, in the middle of my semester, I was expelled from this university for adult sexual consensual behavior. I had done nothing criminal. I had not done anything, but because I had signed this honor code. And at the time I thought, I deserve that. I lost my tuition. I lost time in developing my career. I lost, obviously very, very shaming kind of psychological assault to that. But I was not in a space, because of the conditioning that I had received my entire life as an LDS young woman, to advocate for myself, to even understand that this was psychologically or emotionally and definitely financially abusive to me. And so I allowed for this institution to abuse me, and I was complicit with my own abuse because that was the mindset and the worldview I was in. And for anybody who's listening to this who is LDS, I would really encourage you to think of other cultures, because when it's our own culture, we're conditioned in it. But if, for example, if we take kind of sadly an atrocious practice, I believe it's an atrocious practice, like female circumcision, that should we allow, due to religious values and religious freedom, for certain Muslim sects to circumcise female bodies at young ages? Is that their religious right? Or does that now intersect with a personal freedom right? And is it okay for religions, when they believe in abusive practices, to put that forward because that's their religious freedom? I think these are very complicated ethical dilemmas. I'm not saying there's like a clear answer here, but this is what BYU is basically struggling with.
Yes. Absolutely. And when we talk about exposing shame and reducing shame and the intersection of mental health with this, there's huge implications for that, for students, for faculty, for staff, for families. All of this, is very pertinent to the work that we do, the work that our peers and colleagues do. Like it's a big deal. And so, yeah, it is a really complicated, mucky, like you said, I love that. It's a really complicated, mucky issue, but it's something that I think it's really important to be talking about and to, expose to a broader conversation for people.
Yes. And going back to, you mentioned Elder Holland's talk several years ago, where, he talked about standing firm by our convictions, and even alluded to, having muskets. You talked about the musket fire talk. So he alluded to gathering muskets and being stormed, which, that was a very concerning symbolism that he used, especially when we have so much gun violence in school systems to begin with. I just thought that was very irresponsible story to share, or how to use a metaphor.
Yeah.
And so that was very, very highly concerning. And it was very much driven towards a specific population, right? The LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, at this point is very close to being considered a hate group for the LGBTQ community because of this type of rhetoric and discrimination that it consistently, like pretty much every single general conference and all of these addresses, it's all due to moral panic around LGBTQ plus community. And we see this outside of Mormonism as well, right? There's there's definitely a gender identity panic going on in our current political sphere. Misinformation abounds. Misinformation is supported by many of these religious institutions and religious leaders. And it really has deep implications for not only the students and faculty that attend these universities, but family members, and also how we educate these people has implications on how those folks go into the workforce, how they're going to treat colleagues, how they're going to treat other people in their community, how they're going to vote, and so these have much wider implications that affect our community as a whole, and definitely affect the state of Utah as a whole, which is, right now about 50% of the citizens in Utah identify as LDS. So these have very political, lots of political implications, et cetera. I think too, the other thing is that when you're talking about like programs, like, again, if I was going to be very black and white about this, I'm like, go be stupid on your own dime. Not my problem.
You're self-funded, whatever.
Yeah. You're self-funded. Go do that. Your deal. Yeah. But I do hope that associations will remove accreditation. And I do hope that there is a federal funding consequence to this eventually. So far, this has not happened, right? There's issues. There was a lawsuit that was brought several years ago by religious students from several universities, not just BYU, that went to the federal court, and it was not supported. So that shows how we definitely have this religious bent in our kind of political leaning. But to your point, like professions like science, biology, I was taught in a BYU biology class about evolution.
So was I in the 90s. At BYU, I learned about evolution. Yes.
Right. And I believed in evolution already.
Mm-hmm.
But because I wasn't from Utah and because my family was converts to the church, I wasn't sure. And so it was kind of like a relief. I was like, oh, yeah, good. My church, is up to date, is up to date. And I'm getting this information, which I already kind of knew about because I had been taught evolution in school. And I thought, okay, good. That's wonderful. But if we're going to, for example, we had this situation a few years ago where voice therapy, right? Vocal therapy, which one of the reasons why you might go to voice therapy is if you're going through gender identity things and you're transitioning your gender and you want to train your voice a certain way. Well, it's kind of like being a doctor, right? And you're not like, well, my religion says, I don't believe in blood transfusion, so I'm going to let my patient die because I don't believe that they should receive a blood transfusion. Should doctors have that right due to their own religious belief to not offer? And of course, this comes up a lot with abortion and abortion practices. And should a doctor have a right to withhold medical services to somebody who does not have their same values and beliefs, or even somebody who does, but the society as a whole has said this is the treatment. These are and not the society as a whole, I guess, the field has said this is standard of treatment. This is best standard of practice. And we, especially in social work and mental health, we see this come up all the time, right? Folks who are still practicing conversion therapy, folks who are practicing sex addiction therapy, folks who are practicing just unethical practices as far as imposing their beliefs of God in a therapy setting, or giving homework assignments that are religious in nature. For example, well, you should read your scriptures so that you are not going through a faith transition type of stuff. This is stuff we hear all the time from our clients who come to us after having seen some, what I would consider very unethical therapists, come and tell us these stories on the regular. I mean, this is not like once in a blue moon that I hear a story like this. This is like a weekly occurrence. Mm-hmm. And so are we okay with accrediting a school that is not going to give a person who's going to, let's say I want to become a vocal therapist and I learn many of the skills, but not all of the skills. And then I go out into the world and I get a job where I'm expected to have all of the skills. Mm-hmm. But I graduated from a university that did not afford me best standards of practice and afford me the training I needed. And I've also heard so many people now just kind of being embarrassed of having a Brigham Young degree because they're nervous to put that on their resume, because these are implications that have these have financial implications for people and career implications for people, especially in those kinds of fields. Maybe less so if you're like a mechanical engineer, but definitely in the social sciences and the kind of in the liberal arts degrees.
Well, and also, like, I mean, we all have our anecdotes, but I mean, I know someone recently who got denied into medical school because she is a BYU graduate. And on the denial letter, it stated, thanks, but no thanks, because of BYU's policies against LGBTQ population. We will not admit anyone. So this has like bigger repercussions for, like you said, careers later. And also BYU's talking about having a medical school. Like, I don't understand it. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me. So
can you talk about, there was a second article that you this morning. Can you talk about what this morning?
Yeah, so this morning when I woke up, I got the notification that there's a new article that Peggy Fletcher Stack released early this morning about a talk that the Commissioner of Education, who is Clark Gilbert, who was featured in her prior article a couple of weeks ago, but he spoke last Friday, and he's a general authority. So Clark Gilbert, he spoke to the J. Reuben Clark Law Society annual fireside. And he talked about, he oversees all of the education for the church and, church educational system for institutes and schools. he talked about, he reaffirmed his insistence on church governance at religious educational institutions. And he's a Harvard grad. And so he referenced Harvard. Many institutions like Harvard were founded by religious groups, but they eventually lost their spiritual moorings. He mentions and these are the things that I've been talking about, the things that we've been talking about today. He said they're due to three factors. The first one is outsourcing funding to donors, state and federal government, and other non-religious entities, so Title IV funding. His second one is ceding the choice of school leadership to non-believers. That's not really a thing that BYU deals with. But then the third one I found really fascinating, again, as we're talking about like scholarship and best practices that are held to a very high standard in different fields. But the third thing he says that is like a factor is allowing peer review of scholarly work to increasingly come from people who do not support, or in some cases were even antagonistic to the religious priorities of the university. Such dependence on outsiders will not occur at Latter-day Saint schools, pledged Gilbert, because the church's entire educational system is primarily self-funded. And the board of trustees are the first presidency. Okay, so great. Like you said, that's fine. But again, like they are getting, like, it's more and more insular and more just us. So again, what about the code of ethics that the NASW has? And, I can quote straight from that. Like it's right here, like, social workers, the primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. So our LGBTQ friends and family members are vulnerable. They are marginalized, especially at institutions where they can't live freely and even say who they are, where a faculty member can't affirm their own child or their partner. These have huge mental health implications. So I found it fascinating that came out this morning. And then she interviewed a former BYU administrator who did speak out, talking about his experience as an openly gay administrator in BYU's honor code office, and how he had to leave because he feared he was going to lose his job because of his orientation. So that's the latest in their circling the wagons, really calling out the stuff, like I said, that I've been talking about, the federal funding, the accreditation, peer review. Like that's rough.
Yeah, there are huge mental health implications here, which is why we're addressing this on this program. It's academic implications. And so, the stressors of basically when you discriminate against folks and there's kind of like a movement, a very specific movement to silence, then people tend to, what do people do? They go underground, they go secret. And I know that many BYU professors in the last 2 decades have been LGBTQ affirming, will wear like rainbow pins. We know, so again, if we're going to reject peer-reviewed research, it doesn't align with our religious ideology. Now you have all of the research that shows that LGBTQ folks are at higher risk for suicide, or at higher risk for mental health diagnosis, or higher risk for substance disorders, mainly because of the effects of discrimination, right? And so now I guess we're going to just ignore all of that, and we're going to pretend that there are no LGBTQ students or faculty at BYU, which of course we know that in religious cultures, especially high demand conservative religious cultures, it's not like these folks don't exist. They just exist in secret. And the cost of that for them, and the cost of that, I think, for the community at large is huge, and why these kinds of organizations are bleeding out all of these members, which in a way, I'm kind of glad. I think people should leave. These are not toxic. These are not healthy spaces to continue to commune in, but that comes at a huge cost of family rupture, community rupture, spiritual rupture, because basically folks are saying, no, you're just not allowed to be a spiritual person because we're going to consider you a sinner or something along those lines. And so here, these BYU professors who are willing to wear, just a rainbow pin and be affirming, and therefore, a student who is struggling and maybe even has suicidal ideation knows that somebody's on their side, even if they never approach that teacher. And of course, many of these teachers were approached by minority students that then felt like they had, okay, at least one safe place. Now, now professors can't even do that. It's just the mental health implications are just a disaster. But going back to the academic rigor part, so this is something that just blows my brain. And I would really encourage, parents who have emerging adult kids to think about this. And I remember even this being an issue when I was going back to school, when I was in school in the 90s. I remember one of our professors actually talking to us about this. He told us that BYU, this was a psychology professor, he said BYU is not strong in research and literature review. And therefore, many of the professors do not have that kind of experience. And he had been hired because he did. He was definitely a researcher, and he published lots of articles. And so he was I think it was a research class I was taking, and he was telling us about the importance of this being part of our education. And what he said, back then, now it's just 100 times worse. He said the level of academic excellence of you students does not match the academic level of your professors.
Wow.
The professors are not at the level of the students, which back then I got into BYU. I don't think I could get into BYU today.
Yeah.
Right. I had a 28 on my ACT. I had like a 3.5 GPA. I don't think I could get in today. These are top-notch students. It's very, very competitive, at least to get into Provo BYU. Mm-hmm. These are Ivy League standard students.
Yep.
Going to school with professors who are not by any means Ivy League status in their academic rigor and what they have done to publish, to research, to be, deemed, I guess, high level in their fields, not paid well compared to other professors. They're silenced in academic freedom. They're basically muzzled. And so you have the BYU professors who probably love working there because they are dogmatic and orthodox members themselves. And you have, of course, I think, some excellent professors, but they're not really allowed to bring what they really can bring to the table. So do you want your Ivy League student who is brilliant to go to a university that is not going to match what your adult child can offer from an intellectual perspective? I think parents really need to start looking at this. The other thing that we need to look at as far as Mormon culture, and I think high demand culture to begin with, is that we don't allow emerging adults to be emerging adults. We want to continue to parent them and baby them and protect them and put them in a bubble because we don't want them to be exposed really to the world.
Right.
There was just an article about a mother I think this was Utah State, I believe. I may have that wrong, but there was, a trans woman resident assistant in the dorm, at a co-ed dorm at Utah State. This is a state university. It's not just university.
It's not private school.
And of course, the mother wants to have a fit about this, right? And to impose her own religious views and values and personal beliefs onto a state university and how they are run. And this is the culture that we're currently in. This is the political climate we are in. And the university, it was so interesting to see all the comments, right? The university is like, we're following protocol, and this kind of like BYU says, you knew what you were getting into. If you don't want to be exposed to these things, go to this religious school that will protect you and that will, do your values. But the comments were so interesting, especially from people I could tell were not from our LDS culture. They were like, why is a mother like imposing herself like this? And I mean, if the adult child wants to complain about it, she can complain about it on her own accord. But why is mommy dearest stepping in to protect her emerging adult child in this particular way and setting? And it was so interesting to see how different parts of our communities see boundaries very differently.
Very differently. And they're not experiencing those important developmental, stages and learning those developmental skills. I mean, I would really love to work myself out of a job, but unfortunately, because kids and emerging adults are not experiencing these in these high demand cultures, we're seeing them 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, because they're, having their rumspringa or whatever when they have a faith transition. So, yeah.
Developmental stunting comes back to bite everybody in the butt because, that's kind of Ericksonian theory is that, we all have to go through all the developmental stages. And if you get stuck or kind of stuck in one, even though you continue to age, you're still going to have to at some point progress in that particular developmental stage. And we developmentally stunt people in their own identity development, in their own sexual development. And we stunt people, obviously, in academic development. And in a sense, we infantilize adults. We keep them in that kind of like almost like 13 to 15 type of developmental stage where they still need to adhere to parental authority and external authority and do what's right according to other external forces instead of really understanding their own internal authority and understanding their own values and things. So yeah, this is highly, highly problematic. It's interesting because I can do both. I'm actually very proud to have been a Brigham Young University graduate, and I'm ashamed.
Yeah. Two things can be true, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm ashamed of this institution that is choosing religious comfort and, versus academic rigor.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget my dad telling me this. We were listening to, he was driving me to school one time at BYU. And this was when the September 6th were getting excommunicated. So it was in the news and we were listening to, I don't know, NPR or something. And he said, of course, I think he was very naive in his faith development as well with the Mormon church. But he was like, if it's true, what are we afraid of?
Mm.
If it's true, why are we afraid of ideas and professors and the ideas that these different professors was coming? He was very intellectual. He was a psychiatrist. He was very kind of intellectually minded. He was a medical person. So he was like, we shouldn't be afraid of science and we shouldn't be afraid. If it's true, why are we afraid? Mm-hmm. And of course, I think there's some other implications that can come from that. I think maybe there's good reason why we're afraid.
No, there is.
Ideas that we have are not as true as we might think they are, which of course is what people have to deal with cognitive dissonance and all that. Mm-hmm. What else are you? I feel like I'm talking too much. What else are you?
No, I do want to close with like my thoughts. Like my heart aches for everyone who goes there, who works there. Like I know what it was like to be that weird, liberal, progressive 17-year-old student at BYU. And it was uncomfortable. It was strange being in some of my political science classes, being the lone liberal, but I can't even imagine. That wasn't my identity. That wasn't my orientation. I can't even imagine what it's like now. And my heart breaks for the faculty who are affirming, for the staff members who do care, because I know there's so many. I know them personally, and I know that there's so much more good in the world, and even in that world. And so, yeah, my heart breaks for all of that and for the mental health implications on everyone. But also, I think it's an important conversation to have because it does impact people, not just in Utah, not just at the BYU or at the church schools, but those folks come from all over the country. They come from all over the world, and then they leave and go out into the world with these ideals and these teachings. So yeah, it's heartbreaking for me, and it's infuriating, but it's mostly heartbreaking.
They go out to the world with subpar education and training, and they go out into the world with discriminatory attitudes and beliefs.
Correct.
I mean, that's really what you're going to graduate with as a graduate of Brigham Young University these days.
Yeah.
And that's just, I think, embarrassing and tragic, especially for a culture that, in some ways values education and learning. I mean, learning is one of our principles, right? That's like knowledge. I forget the quote from Joseph Smith, but it's like, knowledge is something that's considered exalted. And it's one of the only things that, if we believe in an afterlife, the only thing we can take with us right, is our experience and knowledge. I guess I'll close with my thoughts. A few years ago, I presented at UAMFT. I was the keynote speaker, and they asked me to speak on pretty tender topics like the intersection between religion, politics, and mental health. And it was so interesting to see. I mean, I've been a speaker for really the last 20 years. I've spoken on many, many different topics. I've spoken all over the country and even internationally. And, I'm not going to say I've gotten always 5-star reviews, but I've always, been in the 4s and the 5s, and in this particular presentation, about 60% were negative reviews that I received from this presentation. And it was so interesting because I asked them all to stand, at the very beginning. And I was like, well, how many of you would say that you are, that you identify with the majority religion of our state, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And about 90% of the room stood up, right? And UAMFT is very Mormon heavy because BYU for a long time was the only program that had a marriage and family therapy program. There's a few other programs now in the state, but so, and I was bringing up ideas, and I never said you should or you shouldn't, but I was asking a lot of ethical questions. So I would put up, for example, current language that's on the LDS website, current language about what we say about gay people, what we say about gender diversity, what we say about even sexual behavior, like, the words fornication and things like that. And then I put up our code of ethics, and I would kind of compare, like, okay, if these are our ethics, as these are the AMFT code of ethics, how does this inform, especially if you have some of these beliefs, and be differentiated enough to be able to separate your own religious practice and worship and belief from the professional work you're doing that is, regulated by your code of ethics and also by the regulatory board of the state, which is supposed to be secular, right? And it was so interesting how many people in their negative reviews basically said, all I learned in this presentation is how if I'm Mormon, I can't be a good therapist.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's interesting. And maybe that's true if that's how you're thinking about this.
Right.
That you don't have the differentiation skills.
Right.
You've not done your own bias work, which is a huge part of our training.
Yes.
Figure out how our own religions, our own family of origins, our own cultural backgrounds inform our mental health practice, because people are coming in with their own religions and their own family of origins and their own cultural backgrounds. And we're not supposed to impose our ideology onto our clients. That's basic ethics. This is not like complicated ethics. This is basic ethics 101 in mental health fields. And how many people were just offended and uncomfortable and wrote scathing reviews, and that this was their biggest waste of time and money that they had ever spent was coming to see me present on this topic. And of course, that hurts. A lot of discomfort for me, obviously, because I'm like, I have to check myself and see, okay, well, where can I improve for sure? And yet it was just so stark from any other experience I've had presenting in my entire career.
Yeah.
Here in Utah, with a BYU adjacent organization, adjacent because obviously UMFT is not Mormon, but so many people involved in that organization are. It's really telling. So I guess our main messages are, can we try to support academic rigor? And if the church is saying they want to do their own funding and they don't care about outside sources and they don't want to learn from outside people and they want to be an insular community. Do I think they have the right to do that? Yes, they have the right. Please don't take government monies. Also, and offer scholarships so that grants and funds that students are dependent on are replaced by the billions of dollars that the church could actually pay for all the education of their students very easily. And I would just plead to parents and to students themselves to look elsewhere for academic rigor.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they're calling it out. Like the quiet things are being said out loud for sure.
Yeah. Which I mean, I'd rather them say we're hateful and discriminatory rather than pretend that they're kind and loving, and just know what product you're receiving.
Yes.
And ask yourself, is that really the product I want for my academic training?
Yeah. Informed consent, right? Yeah.
Well, Angie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, we'd love to hear comments, questions, your thoughts. Stephen Millet gave us a great compliment. He's like, you are both so incredible. Thank you so much. So I'm guessing that's a relative of yours.
It would be my brother, yes.
Yeah. And so, but it is an interesting discussion. Of course, we're open to different perspectives. And if there's topics you want us to discuss, by all means, leave comments in the threads, or you can PM us, anonymously. And for those of you who listen on a regular basis, consider donating to the podcast. And have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishkishay the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our city, We sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No dish ki shake no. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland